So it's 4 o'clock. Would you like to start?
I'd like to call the March 18th, 2021 Economic Development Meeting to order.
Great, thank you.
It's actually 4:01. Now what am I supposed to do? Nothing?
No, I'll take over from you.
Okay, I will turn the table over to Jill.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to be here and to have this presentation, and we welcome all of our special guests. I'll just jump right in. In 2016, NRG Energy announced the shuttering and abandoning of the NRG power plant in Dunkirk due to extensive upgrades and regulatory barriers. So in an effort to be proactive in coming up with solutions on a long-term reuse strategy for the site, the city applied for and was awarded grant funding to commission a reuse alternatives feasibility study. The city partnered with Chautauqua County and the Northern Chautauqua County Community Foundation on this project. We hired Berkman Consultants, and this presentation is the resulting study and recommendations. We'd like to special thanks to the CCIDA, NCCS, Congressman Reed's office, County Executive Wendell's office, and Mayor Rosas. So now I will turn things over to Rebecca Worster.
Thanks, Jill. Today, like Jill stated, we're going to present the study findings and preferred alternatives to the Economic Development Committee for the city and the council. Like Jill said, we submitted the Appalachian Regional Commission power grant in 2018 and were awarded funding in 2019. It's intended to identify viable alternatives for the site to leverage the geographic location on Lake Erie and recent revitalization initiatives that the city has been working on. The study also looks at existing conditions, regional market trends, potential reuse options, preferred options, and implementation strategies that our consultants will get into today. Mark, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah. You know, I would, you know, I just want to caution the audience that, you know, what we're talking about here is concepts. You know, and you know, Kim and her team will talk about the work that was done to kind of arrive upon the top concepts. And there's still more work to be done. You know, these are kind of concepts that we think would work at that site. There would be another phase which would kind of flesh these concepts out, and then, you know, you might wonder, well, then what? You know, what do you do with this? Well, the whole idea here, I think, is to come up with these concepts, flesh them out, look at the economics of them, and then, you know, try to, for lack of a better term, I guess, chase after those types of industries that we're recommending would work well here. And, you know, by doing some kind of letter of interest, try to line up funding through the state, through NYSERDA, that we could, and other incentives, maybe through the IDA and others, to say, hey, this is the type of concept we think will work here. We reach out to the companies, those types of developers that do that kind of thing, and we say, and these are the incentives that we have to offer you. And then also get NRG on board with whatever that concept is to support that type of project, either financially support it or through, you know, other means, maybe by saying that, you know, they recognize that, you know, the facility, that, you know, they should, how do I say it? They should offer it at a cost that is, that makes sense economically for the developer, whatever that means. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we're trying to do here. And so it starts kind of with this concept plan. So I won't say any more. I want to thank everyone for participating. Bergman's been a great partner on this. They've been really responsive and have gone above and beyond the call of duty. It's been a pleasure to work with the city as well. So with that, I kick it over to Kim and her team. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. Jill and Rebecca, are we good to kind of jump in here? Is there anyone else that wants to speak up front?
Mayor, would you like to say anything?
No, just anxiously waiting to hear.
Great, I think we're good.
Okay, great, thank you. So you're going to hear from a few members of our team this afternoon as we walk you through our agenda. And I think Rebecca did a really great job. She kind of took my first few slides and went right through them very efficiently. But we're going to give you a quick study area or study overview, talk a little bit about some of the initial key findings, what we learned about the site and specific to opportunities that might present themselves. And then walk through the alternatives that we evaluated. There were 7 alternatives that we ultimately studied, and landing at a preferred reuse alternative, actually a couple of them that we will also present before rounding out with some of the next steps that Mark had started talking about. So the project team, in addition to Bergman, we can go to the next, perfect, thanks. In addition to Bergman, MRV Group provided a significant amount of work on the project as well. And Michael Nadolo is here this afternoon, and you'll hear from him in a little bit. They really led the market analysis component. We also had the Brownfield Group, who provided just some high-level advisory role to the project based on some of their work across the state specific to significant brownfield reuse projects. And then Empire Building Diagnostics, who provided the cost estimates for the demolition and abatement costs that we'll talk more about in a few minutes. And then in the blue box here, you can see we worked closely with the steering committee. So in addition to representatives from the city as well as the county, we did have representatives from Congressman Reed's office and some other organizations that have backgrounds specific to really significant reuse projects and have direct knowledge about this site and the city of Dunkirk in general. So I'm sure everyone in the room knows exactly where the site is that we're talking about, but you can just see here in plan view. Obviously, the fact that it's a waterfront site does come into the conversation as we think about reuse alternatives. The interesting part of this, you can see kind of the square in the middle of the overarching site. So that's actually the National Grid switchyard, which even as NRG continues to move forward with rethinking their elements of the site, the National Grid switchyard is intended to stay in place. So that does have implications as we start to think about site redevelopment. And obviously the access to transportation corridors is a key asset of this site as well. So when we were initially brought on by the city and the county to look at this site, we were told, we want to see a number of reuse options with a strong emphasis on thinking about workforce development opportunities and really thinking about larger community revitalization goals as part of the overall project, even though we're really focused on the NRG site. How can we make sure that this contributes to overall community revitalization within the city? So that was a real emphasis, recognizing that when NRG closed, there was a loss of jobs and a loss of tax base within the community. And then also thinking about really at top of mind is how can we incorporate renewable energy components into any of these future site alternatives? So thinking about the community revitalization aspect of this, I mentioned, the loss of tax base and the loss of jobs associated with the NRG closure. Also recognizing that, the city has other initiatives going on right now, whether with the BOA or pursuing a DRI. And we really wanted to make sure that this project intersected with those larger community goals. And you can see here just a couple of the graphics showing some of the socioeconomic trends that were identified as part of the report. You can see in the upper right-hand corner from 2000 to what's projected in 2025 to be not a huge loss, but a continuous loss of population base within the city. And then the graphic in the lower right-hand corner is showing median income between 2010 and 2020. And you can see that, after 2015, there was a steady decline in median household income, but luckily that is starting to ramp back up again. And certainly anything that can be done on this site, particularly as it relates to job creation, would have a positive impact on that characteristic. So in order to inform the actual conceptual alternative ideas, there were a number of technical analyses that were completed as part of this process that really informed the alternatives analysis. So part of that was that socioeconomic profile. Part of it was the market analysis, which Michael's going to talk more about. We also completed a phase 1 environmental site assessment, so gave us a sense of what some of the potential considerations could be as it relates to environmental factors on the site. We did a preliminary demolition and abatement cost estimate to understand that if we do look at demolishing the existing structures, what are the implications of that as we think about redevelopment? And then we also looked at a variety of case studies, not only from across New York State, but really across the country as it relates to how other former coal plants have been creatively reused. So we're going to quickly walk through some of the key findings associated with those technical analyses. And I'm going to, at this point, hand it over to Ari from Berkman's office, and she is going to talk a bit more about the environmental and the cost estimates that were prepared. Nope. I can't hear you. Can other people hear her? No, okay.
See, we're not the only ones that have issues.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. So every time I log into a new system, it makes me switch the settings for some reason. I apologize. I haven't used Zoom in a while. Good evening, everyone. So as part of the due diligence for this project, we did a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which looked at any available DC, EPA, boilable documents, any documents provided by NRG, publicly available documents, that sort of thing, historic use of the site. A lot of the documents that we were looking for, a lot of the information we were looking for, such as existing groundwater and subsurface conditions, was not available because it's a utility, a public utility, and it's protected by certain regulatory protections that don't allow the information to be FOILed for. So we did approach NRG for some additional information. However, we were not given a lot of it. So we based our phase 1 findings on what we could find that was available, which was limited, but there was some spill information, some historic tank locations and things like that. We know that based on a site visit that we did, that there were coal ash lagoons on site. So that's an REC, which is a recognized environmental condition. The potential for asbestos lead containing materials was very apparent when we did the site walk, and I'll get more into that when we go into the demolition and abatement costs, abatement and demolition costs. There is a groundwater treatment system that is existing on site and will have to remain on site even if the rest of the site is demolished. It's a current trench system that was around the coal pad. It collects the coal impacted water and sends it to the wastewater treatment plant for treatment, and then it's discharged into the lake. There was very limited information as far as the speedies or the sampling data that's available for that plant, but knowing that that is treating water coming off the coal pad gives us a sense that there is a presence of impacts from the site use on the property. So our recommendation going forward would be to do a phase 2, which would be a subsurface and groundwater investigation, looking for a little bit more information on existing site conditions to understand what the impacts would be if we were to build on the site, what the constraints would be to build on the site. You know, if it's heavily contaminated, you can't do park space or a residential type facility. It would be limiting to just a commercial, or is it more contaminated than that where it needs some remediation before going to that next step. So all right. So we did a walkthrough with Empire Building Diagnostics to look at existing site structures, their assessment of potentially asbestos containing material abatement costs would be. Some of the ductwork and utility lines in the facility are labeled as asbestos or non-asbestos containing, so they must have an existing plan or knowledge of what is ACM and what isn't on the facility. However, we were not given that information. So this cost estimate is based on just our site visit and visual assessment. So they were looking at demolishing the structures. They also have this resource recovery procedure that they do, which is that scrap credit in the red shown below, where they would take all the salvageable metals inside the building, salvageable materials, and sell them and take that cost and credit it to the project. So this is one of the attractive things that we liked about Empire Building Diagnostics. They do this on almost all of their projects. So it kind of gives a cost back to the client. They were looking at crushing and compacting material on site and using it as site cover, which is a great way to remediate a site that has impacts. So that's it's an expensive process, but it's also a site cost savings versus disposing of all that material from the buildings. And then there would be a disposal of some of the material that is unusable and uncrushable to landfill or C&D landfill, which would be a $1.2 million cost. So overall, they were estimating the total demo costs at about $12 million. And prior to demo, they would have to do an abatement, and that cost was very preliminary because there is not a lot of information. 3 to 6 million, it's kind of a wild swing. However, with a more thorough sampling event, or if we had more information, we could probably narrow that number down to something a little more refined. But at the end of the day, we're looking at probably a $20 million cost to abate, demolish, and get the site ready for another use. So.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Michael Indolo from MRB Group. I hope you can hear me, and I successfully unmuted myself. I have a few slides here related to our market analysis. We did a fairly comprehensive market analysis, but I'm just going to report the highest level findings. Many of them you already know. The overall in the region, there's been a loss of jobs in the last 5 years. But you continue to have a very strong manufacturing base, particularly in the turbine and power transmission equipment manufacturing sector. Your economy is changing somewhat, moving more towards service sectors, just like pretty much everybody else across the country. But what's unique about the county is there is still a very, very strong manufacturing base to it. And that's a strength for the county. You have a lot of skills in your workforce that a lot of counties don't have. So next slide, please. So our market analysis went to look at real estate, and we chose an area, basically the Route 90 corridor along the lake, to be able to get a good sense about what's happening regionally, right? You being in that kind of corridor along the lake here. We do think there's plenty of additional opportunity for industry and manufacturing in the county. But because of the real estate fundamentals, we're not going to see any speculative building, we don't believe, or that would be very, for this site, we think it would be very, very unlikely to have that. But it would be something more like a build to suit. So we find a particular user and the user builds something or has something built to suit. We will note that this property is in the federal opportunity zone. And so there are some special credits available to it that would not be available to other areas in the county. So this that could be attractive for the redevelopment of this site. Next slide, opportunities and constraints. Again, a lot of these that you know already, but we'll just mention, there's rail directly to the site. There's the interstate. You have, a port that's right there, harbor and barge access. The Route 90 corridor is a tremendous distribution corridor. And there's been lots and lots of development all across the state on the Route 90 corridor. And being close to it with with an exit is a big advantage. And we have some additional assets that are off-site but connected to the site. There's the landfill where the fly ash was stored, or is stored, I should say. On the other hand, there are some serious constraints. Kimberly mentioned earlier about the switch yard, kind of the hole in the donut, so to speak, that we have to keep in mind as being not available and possibly as something as a hindrance, depending on the use. There were some interconnection issues that is really only applicable for a very large scale power generation use at the site. We don't think that that's really applicable for a very small scale, and we'll talk about that later. And obviously everything that Ari just mentioned about environmental liability and demolition and abatement and remediation costs. And we would have to find something that would allow us to recoup those costs that would be required to get the site ready for development. So that's overall just kind of a market analysis look, and I'll come back in and talk about some uses later on.
Great, thanks, Mike. I was going to say you and I are going to bounce back and forth a little bit over the next series of slides, but so now we're going to walk you through the alternatives that we evaluated as part of this process. And as I mentioned earlier, there were really 7 primary alternatives that were assessed for feasibility specific to reuse of the site. And then, thinking about a goal to really, look at the opportunity to maybe make the site carbon neutral, or really think about, how we can incorporate renewable energy into the site. We did look at a number of carbon offsets that Michael is going to talk more about that could be applicable to more than one of these different site reuse alternatives. We essentially characterized the 7 alternatives into 3 overarching classifications. So alternatives that were pretty quickly dismissed from further evaluation, and I'll talk a little bit more about those and why. A feasible alternative that poses some significant challenges, but we didn't necessarily want to say it was infeasible. And then alternatives with the greatest opportunity for successful reuse of this site. And we really took all of those 7 alternatives and compared them against this series of evaluation criteria. So looked at how each of those alternatives impacted local job creation, tax revenue, overall feasibility from a redevelopment perspective. We looked at investment and considered investment costs, funding support from public agencies, and willingness for the private sector to make investments. We also looked at political support, recognizing that can also come into play, especially when we're thinking about energy use, and then site cleanup, and what was the level of effort associated with each of those alternatives as it relates to reusing the site. So before we jump into the 7 alternatives in more detail, I'm going to bounce it back to Michael, and he's going to talk about the carbon offset elements that we considered as part of the project.
Great, thank you. And as a preamble here, I'm going to stop presenting for a second, and I'm just going to simply say, from my point of view, if you take nothing else away from tonight's presentation, I think the key aspect of what we found as a consulting group is that there are environmental considerations and there's financial considerations and there's market considerations. But because of the challenges to this site, it's going to require a politically feasible solution. Just because of the numbers that Ari mentioned earlier about demolition, abatement, and remediation, our takeaway is to make this work, we're going to have a lot of political will to throw dollars at this. So everything I'm going to talk about next is all ways that we can generate that political support, right? Ways that we can go back to the state or go back to NYSERDA or go back to DEC or whatever the agency is and say, hey, we got a great project, okay? So one of them is about these carbon offsets, and we have a number of different opportunities that we think that you can do that. And this is all about how do you tell the story to the state? Biomass, landfill gas, solar power, and the fly ash at the landfill. So let's take those in order. Biomass, the next slide, please. We would have to size the plant for a biomass power generation in such a way that we would have enough feedstock that would be sourced sustainably. And so in the definition of the state right now, to be sustainably sourced, we're really looking at wood waste, which means to say we're not cutting virgin wood to burn it, right? We're taking existing wood waste. And so the total amount available is fairly low. And so when we talk about a biomass plant, we think the sizing for a sustainable wood waste plant would be about 500 kilowatts. So a relatively small plant. And what we did is we said, hey, if you had one of these, what is the carbon offset? We could go back to the state and say, hey, if we did this, and the answer is 93,000 tons over 30 years. We use 30 years as kind of a general lifetime cycle here. So we said, okay, the carbon offset you could get for this solution would be 93,000 tons. The next one is about the landfill. And now when I say landfill, we're not talking about the fly ash landfill. We're talking about the landfill, the municipal landfill, the Chautauqua County landfill. And right now, the county is looking at renewable natural gas, converting that methane into a usable product that industry can use. And so the connection to the site would be if we found a use at the site that would require renewable natural gas, RNG, which again is methane that's been transformed, that's how we could tie it to the site. And that over 30 years, the offset for carbon is actually quite substantial. It's about 3.5 million tons. And so unfortunately, this one is something that we may or may not be able to find a use on the NRG site that would need that level of gas offtake. But that's one option. And the next one is solar. And solar has a number of components, and I won't go into like great deal about what those are, but we have the NRG site itself. And then we have the two fly ash landfills that are about 5 miles away from the city. And one of them is called the Don Frame, and the other one is owned by NRG. And we'll talk about the fly ash site in a little bit more detail in just the next slide. But here we say, if we could put solar panels out there, we kind of looked at it from a very general point of view and said, hey, we think we could get a solar array between all three sites of somewhere between 40 and 60 megawatts. We would probably look at this from maybe multiple different options, maybe a couple 20s and one larger one, or maybe three 20s, 320 megawatt arrays. And if we did all of that, we would have a carbon offset of somewhere between 1.7 and 2.8 million tons here. And then finally, well, actually, we'll look at this in a little bit here. We don't have a slide in this part, but we do have another carbon offset, which is related to the reuse of the fly ash. And again, this is one way for us to say, hey, go back to the state and combine some or all of these and say, hey, we have this great package that fits your renewable goals and your carbon neutrality goals and helps you meet your public policy highlights, right, of the governor.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the actually three alternatives that we looked at and were pretty easy to dismiss just because of the challenges that the reuse alternatives would face. So We did look at power plant repowering. Back in, I think it was 2013, NRG was looking at converting the coal plant to natural gas, and due to lawsuits and costs, they quickly halted that conversion. And looking at estimates now, I think that conversion would take multiple years and over $100 million in order to successfully convert to a natural gas plant. So that, coupled with really low political support, or maybe no political support currently at the state level, really makes this alternative fairly infeasible right from the start, and doesn't accomplish the overarching goal of looking at carbon neutral and renewable energy options for the site. We did also look at offshore wind, and while the actual wind turbines would not be on the NRG site, there's an opportunity to kind of interplay offshore wind with the NRG site. However, again, due to a combination of really investment costs, recognizing this is not a priority in this area for New York State, and some of the positions even of the city of Dunkirk, we realized that this was not really a high priority feasible alternative that warranted further exploration at this point. And there were higher and better end uses for this site that helped to really achieve some of the overarching goals that were established early on. And then the third one we looked at was the microgrid development. So essentially creating an independently controlled power system that's really separate from the main power grid. And again, typically these are anchored by fossil fuel power plants, but they can incorporate, and more are transitioning to having a renewables component. But this is one, there's some financial uncertainty tied to, the impacts and the costs associated with this. We're not seeing a high level of government support for these types of projects. And oftentimes microgrids are tied to a community-based need. So you have, a really significant end user that has high amounts of power need. And, we don't really have a compelling energy issue here in Dunkirk. So this one also ranked fairly low as we considered our evaluation criteria, as you can see on the chart on the right. So those were the three alternatives that, were looked at, thought about, discussed, but then pretty quickly dismissed due to the challenges. There is one end use that, although feasible, and certainly when we looked at case studies, there are some intriguing case studies from across the country, thinking about really creative uses, reuses for former coal plants, but that is the clean slate option. And essentially, when we looked at what we're calling clean slate, this was essentially saying, okay, we're doing very in-depth remediation, abatement, maybe some partial demolition, maybe full demolition of existing structures. And we're not necessarily pigeonholing what the end use would be, but it could be a range of end uses such as recreation, public open space, could be a mixed use development, could be an education component, but something that has more of a public benefit component to it, maybe leverages the waterfront location of the site. However, when looking at that alternative, there are some immediate challenges that come to mind as we think about any of those reuse options. Part of those being the high site prep costs that we walked through, 38 million probably being a conservative number given all of the things we don't know about the site and the buildings at this point. We've talked about the switchyard location a number of times. It's literally is right in the middle of the site. So anything you would do at this point, you'd have to build around it. We did talk to them regarding, could the switchyard be relocated down the road? And the answer was, sure it could, as long as someone else pays for it, right? So there's another pretty significant cost that would get added onto that already 38 million if you really did want to completely clear the site for a reuse. So, when we look at this compared to the other alternatives that Michael's about to walk through, it just didn't make as much sense to continue advancing evaluation of this alternative, recognizing some of those upfront environmental and cost challenges that this reuse faced. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Michael to talk about the good news.
Okay, all right, great. So the good news is we do have a few options and a few combinations of options for the site that we think could work. One has to do with industrial development, just straight up industrial development. There's usable acreage at the site and it's consistent with its previous use, in industry. And you could set up a manufacturing or distribution logistics center here, and it could be combined with workforce training. There is significant acreage. We do think that at a minimum, it could fit a 40,000 to 50,000 square foot building, maybe more, just on the open land that's unencumbered by the coal ash lagoons and the current building. And then more, obviously, if there's more remediation and abatement. So this is one. I will say on the industrial development side, one of the options is related to that fly ash reuse site. Reusing the fly ash from the landfill, there's a process that it does have to go through. Well, there's a rail line right between the two. Could this be the place where that happens? It's possible. So that's one example of a local specific reuse that could happen. Industrial development has a lower cleanup threshold. And there's things like the opportunity zones and the New York State Brownfield Cleanup Program, and the possibility of taking advantage of some of that infrastructure we talked about earlier with the rail line and the barge. So we think this is a possibility. Data center is one that people may not think about, but is actually a use that is either being done or is being contemplated for a number of coal-fired power plants across the country, including a couple in New York. And this is basically rooms and rooms and rooms full of servers. Because of the electrical infrastructure and the fact that these sites require quite a bit of electricity, the switch yards, instead of being a liability, are actually an asset, a significant asset for a data site user. It also needs a cool climate. It needs a secure area. You offer all of those. There's, on the next slide, you'll see there's not a lot of job creation. There's some, and the jobs that are part of that are very well-paid jobs. But there is some employment, not a lot, but there's a lot of tax base. The data centers have a lot of assessed valuation, and so there's something to be said in terms of the give back to the community. It's consistent with other uses, and because it's still an industrial type of use, or industrial commercial, I should say, the cleanup costs are a little bit more reasonable. Battery storage is something that could also go on the site. And these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We could have an industrial use and a data center use and a battery storage, maybe not all three, but we could have at least two in there. Battery storage is something that's also a priority of the current energy policy, to be able to store and then use energy at peak times. This site, because of the transmission lines that go into here and the switchyard, would make actually a very good site for battery storage. We're pitching at about 80 megawatts. That seems to be a good utility scale type of storage facility. And here again, very little or no jobs, but tax base, significant tax base, and like we said, could match well with a data center and a battery storage, and or other uses on the site. And I think I hand it back to you, Kimberly.
Great. So segue. So, through that evaluation, we did identify two preferred reuse concepts, and I'm not going to rehash a lot of the material that was already presented by Michael in some previous slides, but we do recognize with these preferred reuse alternatives that there are other regional assets that should be taken into account as we think about reuse of the NRG site. So the two preferred reuse concepts both involve the data center. And I think Michael just did a good job of highlighting some of the benefits of that reuse on site. And these are also summarized here on these charts. But so he also talked about the opportunity for, multiple reuses on the site, right? So data center being one reuse option, and then the second being really a combination of an industrial use and the data center use on site, either of which could take advantage of fly ash from the landfill site, could potentially incorporate solar as part of the larger vision, or biomass. And both of these options, we think, really provide a lot of opportunity for not only the job creation and the tax base creation, which contributes to that bigger picture goal of community revitalization, but both of these also help to achieve the energy goals for the site as well. And Michael also mentioned there are some great precedents for data center projects, not only across New York State, but really across the country as a whole. One of those being, if we can go to the next slide, Sam, one of those being the project that is currently ongoing in Somerset, New York, where they are doing a data center and solar power farm on a former coal-fired power plant near Lake Ontario, looking at almost 160 full-time jobs as part of that project. So a great precedent to be thinking about as Dunkirk continues to work with NRG and thinking about revitalization of this site. And to that end, next steps. So, immediate next steps and some bigger picture. The phase 2 environmental site assessment is important just to really make sure that the city has a solid understanding of the site, and any potential end users would want to have that understanding of any site impacts or mitigation requirements that might be associated with end uses. Again, we did 2 kind of cursory walkthrough of the sites and the buildings. So a more detailed facilities assessment and understanding of site infrastructure would be important to have prior to moving forward with next steps. If applicable, looking at electrical interconnection costs, and we can talk more about that. And then energy modeling. So as we start to think about, how we are helping to advance the state's energy goals, whatever the end use scenario is for this, looking at energy modeling to really think about the implications as it relates to energy use. And then just, immediately, or really maybe these are ongoing and then immediate as well. Continuing to collaborate with NRG and making sure they're strong partners, obviously, is the current property owner for that site. Based on that list of additional studies that may be warranted or make sense for the project, continue to assess funding resources. And I think that the city and county are actively working on that already. And then, as I mentioned, also funding for that phase 2 environmental site assessment, which would also require some cooperation from NRG as well in order to complete that. So with that, I think we are ready to open up the floor and answer any questions that you might have.
Lance, what do you got?
Yeah, right.
Well, it's obvious that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and it's gonna take us a while, to finish up these steps, but I think we're really moving in the right direction. I think a big key player is obviously NRG, and having them on the same page with the city. We've been working with them hand in hand on this, but they definitely need to be involved, and we are moving forward with a grant application to the Appalachian Regional Commission, which we were originally funded to do this study, to get funding for the phase 2 environmental site assessment and the other kind of next steps that Kimberly just stated, the detailed facilities and site infrastructure assessments, some energy modeling and electric interconnection costs assessments. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think that we're moving in the right direction to queue up a package that we can bring forth to different developers that fit our preferred alternative for the use of the site. So again, we'll just keep moving on and try our best to get this going.
Rebecca, I got a question. We can't do anything, see if I'm correct, without the blessing.
Yeah, they're ultimately the owners, you know, so we have to work with them and yeah, which we have been. I think we've had a really good relationship so far, and we'll continue that relationship. And I think that us doing some work on our end is best to move forward to try to get the reuse for the site.
Also, Rebecca, off what Marty just said, are they willing to kick in some monies to go into something energy, or are we out on our own in left field looking for the fundings?
That's a great question.
Mark, did you hear that question?
Yeah, I did. You know, we've talked to them about that, and so they haven't said no. So, you know, so there's certainly a window there. I think if you compare the relationship that we have with them versus the relationship the community has with the North Tonawanda plant, it's night and day. And so I feel really good about, you know, their involvement in this. We've been upfront with them about what our next steps are. We've said that we would like them to be a part of funding the next phase. So we don't know what exactly that looks like, but they know that we're going to be coming to them. How about that?
That's okay.
Quick question to follow up on that. You guys can probably predict what are the current and future stressors that face NRG that would make them maybe want to come to us, and they're going to need our help. There's going to be environmental issues and things like that that are going to be changing now. And they got a fly ash place that's going to be, it's not going to be less restrictive, it's going to become more restrictive. There's going to be more restrictions on their vacant land. I just wondered what your perspective is. If you get in the shoes of NRG, look at them from their point of view. Is there something that's going to be happening now or in the future that's going to make them want to come and talk to us to be partner in and make these things happen?
Let me just say generally, Randy, that at the end of the day, if NRG is looking at a very large cost for cleanup, right? Because ultimately they're responsible, and we come to them with an alternative that is less costly than that, then that looks like what we're talking about is an investment in whatever alternative seems to make sense. I mean, that's sort of what we're looking at. Now, I didn't quite answer your question, but that's why we wanted to know to a certain level, what are we talking about in terms of cleanup? Because that's a real incentive for them to want to invest in something in the future that gets them out of that liability.
I think you did answer my question. There's definitely going to be some things there that are developing politically, environmentally, things like that are going to want to part. I think there's a good future for our partnership if we watch for all of the ways we can put the pieces of puzzle together.
Exactly. That's why we broke it down originally. We weren't thinking about a two-phase project, but we said, well, wait a second. Let's start off with the environmental, make that kind of phase one, just so we kind of understand what's the major challenge there. What are we looking at? What's the nut? And if we can come up with this alternative in the future that makes sense to them to be an investor in, that helps them get out of that liability, then that would make sense to them, I would think.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, this is really great. Thank you so much. I know that this the process took a lot of time and collaboration and effort. And it shows in the work. I think this is really interesting, and I know I look forward to diving into it more, and appreciate all of your efforts. So
I think it's important to let our council members know that we are working collaboratively as a team on this thing, and you know, if they have questions to ask us, that we are going to answer them as a team because we are working together.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us and for this great presentation. We appreciate
Thank
all
you.
of your efforts.
Thank you.
Okay.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Nice job, Bergman team. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good night.
Oh, and one final thing to note is that we will be having a public presentation on this, so that date and time will be to be determined, but we'll be unveiling it to the public shortly.
I didn't want to say it, but I have a great concern with when they start doing anything, whether it be cleanup or that, what is going to affect the waters around where Niagara Mohawk is, because there's how many years of sludge that went into the ground around that whole area.
Brady can answer.
Restrictions on working around an area like that are so, it's, at the very least, if they don't maintain all of those things within the site, the fines from DEC are $32,500 a day. So that contractor is gonna face some, any kind of construction project right now, that's a very good question. These people know that they can't, especially against Lake Erie, which is a highly protected water body, let alone Canada Creek or something like that. So it's gonna be, that they're gonna have to figure out a way, and there are ways to keep containing it.
Now, let me ask this question. If it just goes dormant, nothing happens, can something seep in there?
Yeah, and then that's what Mark said, is that this is not gonna get any better from their point of view. If they have an opportunity to join with us to solve this problem.
Yeah, and to speak to your concern, any contractor that's gonna be doing any remediation or cleanup work will have to follow a really detailed, probably DEC approved plan that.
The SWIFT, stormwater management
Yep,
plan.
yep,
all kinds
yeah.
of things.
Yes, so that they don't disturb or.
Because I know a lot of the fishermen will go totally ballistic
Right.
with because you're disturbing how many years of,
And that thing was built after World War II, so there's all kinds of stuff in.
yeah.
Well, thanks, everyone.
I think
See
that's
everyone,
it.
yeah.
Okay, it's 5 to 5 and the meeting is now adjourned.
Here we go.
I'm not gonna go home and take a nap right now.
Yeah.